The sun was slowly setting over the small town of Rockdale, painting the streets with golden light. People were returning home from work, cars hummed along the road, and children laughed as they ran toward the park. Among the movement of everyday life, there was one man who always stood out, not because he wanted attention, but because of how quietly he carried himself. His name was Marcus Reed. Every morning, Marcus rolled his wheelchair down the narrow sidewalk that led to the community center. His face was calm, his eyes thoughtful, and his movements slow but steady. The townspeople knew him as the quiet man who helped at the youth center, fixing broken chairs, teaching kids how to draw, and sometimes telling old army stories that never revealed too much. He was polite, kind, and never caused trouble. But no one really knew Marcus. Some people whispered about him. He used to be a soldier, they said. Got hurt overseas. Others said he was just another veteran who had lost everything and come here to start over. Whatever the story was, no one dared to ask him directly. He kept to himself, never bragging, never angry, never loud. There was something about his silence, strong, deep, and peaceful, that made people respect him without understanding why. Every day at 6 a.m., Marcus wheeled himself to the small diner near the corner of Pine Street. The waitress, a cheerful woman named Carla, always had his coffee ready. Black, no sugar, no cream, she'd say with a smile. He'd nod, say thank you, and quietly sit by the window looking out at the world passing by. He never rushed. He never complained. He just was. One morning, a group of teenagers came into the diner laughing loudly. One of them, trying to show off, accidentally bumped into Marcus's wheelchair. His coffee spilled slightly, staining his sleeve. The boy froze, waiting for anger or shouting. But Marcus simply smiled, grabbed a napkin, and said, "No harm done." The boy looked confused. "Aren't you mad?" Marcus shook his head. "You only get mad when it helps someone," he said quietly. "And this doesn't help either of us." The boy didn't know what to say, but the kindness in Marcus's tone stayed with him long after that day. When Marcus wasn't at the diner, he was at the youth center, repairing old computers or teaching the neighborhood kids discipline through simple exercises. The children respected him deeply, not because he yelled or demanded it, but because of how calm and fair he was. If two kids fought, Marcus didn't scold them. He'd simply say, "You can fight with your fists or you can fight with your mind. One makes you sore, the other makes you strong." And somehow they always listened. At night, Marcus would return to his small apartment at the edge of town. It was quiet, a single bed, a few photos on the wall, and a folded American flag in a glass frame. Sometimes, when the streets were empty and the town slept, Marcus would sit by the window holding a small silver locket. Inside was a picture of a woman and a young boy, his family from another life, one lost to the war he never spoke about. He'd look at the photo, close his eyes, and whisper, "I kept my promise." Then he'd set the locket down and fall asleep in his chair, the hum of distant cars lulling him to rest. People often noticed the scars on his hands, deep, rough marks that told stories of battles no one could imagine. Some days when children asked about them, Marcus would smile and say, "These? Just reminders to be careful with fire." He never spoke about what really happened. The missions, the ambush, the day his team was attacked and he lost both his legs saving 3 of his men. To the world, Marcus was a man who had accepted his fate and moved on. But inside, he carried the weight of memories heavier than any wheelchair. Despite everything, he never lost his kindness. When neighbors needed help fixing something, Marcus was the first to arrive. When an old lady dropped her groceries, he was there before anyone else. And when a stray dog followed him home one evening, he simply smiled and said, "Guess you're my new patrol buddy," and kept it. People respected Marcus, but they didn't really see him. To most, he was just that quiet man in the wheelchair. No one knew the truth, that behind that calm smile lived a soldier who had once faced death without blinking, who had seen the worst of humanity yet still believed in good. He didn't wear medals. He didn't talk about courage. He simply lived it, every day in small acts of patience and compassion. But destiny has a strange way of revealing the truth. The peace Marcus had built for himself in Rockdale was about to shatter in a single evening. Because one night, when police sirens echoed down the street and chaos broke out near the corner store, Marcus Reed, the quiet stranger everyone ignored, would find himself at the center of a storm. A wrong place, a wrong time, and a world that had no idea who they were really dealing with. The night was unusually quiet in Rockdale. The streets were half empty, the air cool and heavy after a light rain. The glow from the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, painting golden streaks across the road. Inside his small apartment, Marcus Reed sat by the window, sipping tea and reading an old, worn-out book. His dog, Ranger, lay curled up beside him, asleep. The stillness was comforting, until the peace was broken by distant sirens. Marcus looked up. The sound came closer, bouncing off the narrow streets. He could hear the tires screeching and the faint shouts of police radios. For a man who had spent half his life in chaos, the noise wasn't frightening. It was familiar. Too familiar. He sighed and rolled closer to the window. Across the street, flashing blue and red lights painted the walls of the old corner store. 2 police cars had pulled up fast, their doors flying open. Officers jumped out, shouting to each other, scanning the area with flashlights. Marcus watched carefully. He didn't see any danger, just confusion. It seemed like another misunderstanding. He turned his chair away, thinking it was none of his business. But then came a loud crash, glass breaking, a voice shouting, "Stop right there!" Marcus's heart tightened. His instincts woke instantly, the same sharp alertness that had once saved his life on the battlefield. He couldn't help it. The soldier in him never really slept. He rolled outside onto the sidewalk, his movements steady and deliberate. Ranger followed quietly, tail low. Across the street, chaos unfolded. A man had apparently run out of the corner store and disappeared down the alley. The cops were on edge, young, nervous, and quick to act. One of them spotted Marcus near the curb.
"Hey, you!"
the officer shouted. "Stop right there." Marcus froze, surprised. "Me?" The officer rushed forward, flashlight blinding Marcus's eyes. "Yeah, you. Don't move." Marcus lifted his hand slowly. "Officer, I think there's a misunderstanding. I live right here." But the officer wasn't listening. His partner joined in, both of them tense and jumpy. "We got a report of a suspect leaving the store," one said. Black male, mid-40s, dark jacket. Marcus glanced down at himself. Black jacket, gray hoodie. "Wrong place. Wrong time. I just came out to check the noise," he said calmly. "I didn't see anything. Step away from the chair." The first officer barked as if Marcus could stand up. The tone made Marcus sigh softly. "Officer," he said patiently, "I can't step away from the chair. I'm paralyzed." That only seemed to irritate them more. "Don't get smart with me," one said. "Hands where I can see them." By now, neighbors had started peeking through windows, recording with their phones. The flashing lights made everything look more dramatic than it really was. Marcus stayed calm, his voice steady. "You're making a mistake," he said again. But they didn't want to hear it. Within moments, one officer moved behind him, gripping his shoulders roughly. Ranger barked, confused and protective. "Control your dog," the second officer shouted. "He's not dangerous," Marcus said, trying to stay calm. "Please just listen." The words were cut short by the sound of handcuffs clicking around his wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin. The neighbors murmured. Someone shouted, "He didn't do anything." Another voice said, "That's Marcus. He works at the youth center." But the officers ignored it. They were too caught up in the rush of authority, in proving they'd done their job. Marcus lowered his head. He didn't fight. He didn't yell. He just stared at the ground, breathing slowly. Inside, a storm brewed, not of anger but of deep, controlled disappointment. He'd faced enemies with guns, bombs, and hatred, yet this somehow felt heavier. One of the officers leaned down. "You've got quite a mouth for a suspect," he said. Marcus looked up, meeting his eyes. "And you've got quite an attitude for someone sworn to protect," he replied quietly. His calmness unsettled the officer, who turned away quickly. Minutes later, they loaded Marcus into the back of the squad car, wheelchair and all. Ranger barked frantically, chasing after them until a neighbor grabbed him gently. "It's okay, boy," the man said softly. "He'll be all right." Inside the car, Marcus stared out the window as the city lights blurred by. He thought about how strange life was and how quickly peace could turn into chaos. He wasn't angry, not yet. He'd learned long ago that anger only clouded judgment. What he felt instead was sadness, not for himself, but for how blind the world still was. At the station, he was rolled into an interrogation room. The walls were white, cold, and bare. A young officer set a file on the table, looking proud of himself. caught him near the scene, he said to another cop walking in. Marcus sat quietly. His mind was elsewhere, scanning details, observing, remembering. Every sound, every motion, every look. The soldier in him was awake again, analyzing everything like a mission. As the officers began their questioning, Marcus said nothing. He knew how this game worked. Let them talk. Let them make their assumptions. He had nothing to prove, not to them. Outside the room, the chief walked by, glancing through the small glass window. His eyes paused on Marcus's arm, on a faded tattoo barely visible under his sleeve. It was the Delta Force insignia. The chief froze, his breath catching. He recognized it instantly. There were only a handful of men in the entire country who bore that mark, and one of them was sitting quietly in his interrogation room, handcuffed, calm and completely aware of everything happening around him. The quiet stranger they had just arrested was no ordinary man. The interrogation room was small, cold and painfully silent. The flickering fluorescent light buzzed softly above, casting sharp shadows on the walls. Marcus sat quietly at the metal table, his hands cuffed, his wheelchair locked in place. Across from him, two officers shuffled papers and whispered to each other, their confidence dripping with arrogance. To them, Marcus Reed was just another suspect. Another name, another face, another problem to solve. They didn't see a hero. They saw a man who looked out of place. A man they thought they had caught. Officer Daniels leaned back in his chair, smirking. "So Marcus Reed," he said slowly, flipping through the file. "You live alone, no family, no job on record. Just hanging around near the crime scene. That doesn't look good for you." Marcus didn't respond. His face was calm, his gaze steady. Years of discipline had taught him the power of silence. Daniels leaned forward, his tone sharper. "You think not talking makes you smart? You were there when the robbery happened. You expect me to believe you didn't see anything?" Marcus's eyes lifted slightly. "I already told you, officer," he said evenly. "I was at home. I heard the noise and came outside to check. I didn't see who did it." The second officer, a younger man named Lewis, scoffed. "Convenient. The store gets hit and you're the only one rolling around outside?" Marcus let out a slow sigh. "You're making a mistake." Daniels smirked. "We'll see about that." The room fell silent again. The ticking of the wall clock filled the air. Marcus's mind, however, was far from still. His training had kicked in the moment they brought him inside. He scanned every corner of the room, the two-way mirror, the camera's angle, the exit door. He even noticed the small crack on the table's metal surface and the slight nervous tremor in Officer Lewis's hand. He could read people like open books. It wasn't arrogance, and it was survival. Daniel slammed his hand on the table suddenly. "You know what I think? I think you're hiding something." Marcus didn't flinch. His voice was quiet but steady. "I'm hiding nothing. But maybe you're not seeing everything." Lewis frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Marcus didn't answer. He simply leaned back slightly, his eyes calm, almost pitying. The door creaked open. The chief of police, Captain Harris, stepped in holding a file. His expression was serious, his tone heavy. "Daniels, Lewis, and out now." The two officers looked confused. "But sir, we—" "Now," Harris repeated firmly. They hesitated but obeyed. Once they were gone, Harris closed the door and took a long breath. He looked at Marcus, studying him for a moment before speaking. "Sergeant Marcus Reed," he said quietly, "United States Delta Force, retired, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 classified rescue mission in Yemen. You were awarded the Silver Star and the Distinguished Service Cross." Marcus's eyes met his. There was no surprise, only quiet acknowledgement. "That was a long time ago," he said. The chief nodded slowly. "Yes, but you didn't tell my officers that." "I didn't think they'd listen," Marcus replied softly. "They already decided who I was the moment they saw me." For a moment, the chief said nothing. His expression softened, guilt flickering in his eyes. He walked closer, placing the file on the table. Inside were Marcus's records, military photos, commendations, mission reports. One picture stood out. Marcus in uniform standing tall beside his team, a younger man with fierce eyes and steady posture. "You saved 6 men that day," the chief said, tapping the photo. "You carried 2 of them half a mile after the explosion. You lost your legs doing it." Marcus looked down at his wheelchair, then back at the chief. "We all lost something," he said quietly. The chief swallowed hard. I'm sorry, Sergeant. You shouldn't have been treated this way. Marcus gave a faint smile, not of forgiveness but of understanding. You're not the one who needs to apologize. Outside the room, Daniels and Lewis stood by the hallway watching through the glass window. Confusion and shame battled in their faces as they listened. They couldn't believe the man they had mocked, pushed, and handcuffed was a decorated war hero, a Delta Force commander. Daniels muttered under his breath, Delta Force? That's impossible. The chief opened the door and stepped out. His voice was sharp now. You two, in my office now. Marcus remained still, staring at his reflection in the glass. For years he had lived quietly, never asking for recognition, never speaking about his past. He had fought too many battles, not just on foreign soil but inside his own heart. He had learned that not every fight needed a weapon. Some only needed patience. After a few minutes, the chief returned with a key and unlocked Marcus's handcuffs. You're free to go, sir, he said respectfully. Marcus rubbed his wrists, the metal marks faintly red. Thank you, he said simply. The chief hesitated, then added softly, If you ever need anything and anything at all, this department owes you. Marcus nodded but didn't answer. He turned his chair toward the door, pausing briefly. You want to do something for me, Captain? Anything. Teach your men the difference between suspicion and respect, he said quietly. It could save more lives than you think, and with that Marcus rolled out of the room. As he left the station, the night air hit his face, cool, calm, and free. Ranger was waiting for him outside, tail wagging furiously. Marcus smiled, patting his head. Let's go home, buddy, he whispered. Behind him, through the glass doors of the station, the officers watched in silence, humbled, ashamed, and forever changed. They had arrested a man they thought was weak. But what they discovered instead was strength in its purest form. The next morning, the Rockdale Police Department was unusually silent. The hallways that usually echoed with laughter, phones ringing, and chatter now carried only whispers. Everyone had heard what happened the night before, how 2 patrol officers had arrested a man in a wheelchair, who turned out to be a decorated Delta Force commander. Files were being passed around, news spreading faster than wildfire. Most couldn't believe it. Marcus Reed, the quiet man from Elm Street, was the same soldier whose name once appeared in classified military briefings. In the chief's office, Captain Harris sat with a heavy heart, reading through Marcus's record again. The words felt unreal. Master Sergeant Marcus Reed, U.S. Army Delta Force, multiple combat tours. Highly classified missions. Injured in line of duty while protecting his team. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. How could we be so blind? He whispered. Meanwhile, in the locker room, Officer Daniel sat in silence, staring at his reflection. The memory of Marcus's calm face haunted him. The way the man never raised his voice even when they treated him like a criminal. Daniels thought he understood power, but last night had shown him something deeper. Real strength doesn't shout. It endures. Officer Lewis walked in quietly, guilt written all over his face. You saw the reports, right? He asked softly. He saved his whole team, carried 2 men with his bare hands after the explosion. Daniels nodded slowly. Yeah, and we handcuffed him. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence between them said everything. Across town, Marcus sat by his window again, the morning sun pouring gently through the curtains. Ranger lay at his feet, half asleep. The world outside moved as usual. Cars passing, kids playing, people going to work. Marcus's life had returned to quiet, at least for now. His phone buzzed. It was a call from the local news. They had somehow found out what happened and wanted to feature his story. Marcus hesitated, staring at the phone for a long time before answering. This isn't a story, he said simply. It's a misunderstanding. But sir, the reporter said eagerly, people should know who you are, what you've done. Marcus sighed. They don't need to know me. They just need to learn not to judge what they see. He ended the call, his thoughts heavy. Later that day, there was a knock on his door. When he opened it, he saw Captain Harris standing there, not in uniform, but in a plain shirt holding a folder. His face looked worn, humble. May I come in? He asked softly. Marcus nodded and moved aside. Harris placed the folder on the table. I brought your records, he said. They were in the federal archives. I thought you should have them. Marcus looked at the folder. Photos, medals, mission notes. Things he hadn't seen in years. I didn't ask for these, he said quietly. I know, Harris replied. But you earned them. You deserve respect. Marcus looked out the window. Respect isn't earned with medals, Captain. It's earned with how you treat people, especially the ones who can't fight back. Harris nodded, his voice low. You're right. And I want to make things right too. The department's hosting a community event next week. Would you consider speaking there? Marcus turned to him, surprised. Me? I'm not a speaker. Maybe not, Harris said with a faint smile. But people listen when truth speaks, and you carry a lot of it. Marcus hesitated, then gave a small nod. I'll think about it. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Marcus sat outside watching kids play basketball at the community court. Some of them waved at him. They knew him from the youth center. He smiled back, remembering the strength it took to rebuild his life after the war. One of the boys ran up, breathless. Mr. Reed, my dad said you used to be a soldier. Is that true? Marcus chuckled softly. Something like that, he said. Wow, the boy said, eyes wide. Were you scared? Marcus looked out at the setting sun. Everyone gets scared, he said after a moment. The trick is not letting fear decide who you become. The boy nodded thoughtfully, then ran back to his friends. Marcus smiled faintly, a rare, peaceful kind of smile. Later that night, Captain Harris stood before a camera crew at the police station, giving a press statement. His voice was firm but remorseful. Yesterday, our officers made a grave mistake, he said. They arrested an innocent man, a war hero, because they saw what they expected, not what was real. That man's name is Marcus Reed. He is a retired Delta Force commander who has done more for this country than most of us ever will. On behalf of this department, we deeply apologize. The video went viral within hours. People across the city, and soon across the country, began talking about Marcus Reed. Some called him the silent hero. Others said he was the reminder America needed, proof that true warriors don't boast. They build. Marcus watched the news quietly that night. He didn't smile, didn't cry. He simply turned off the TV, closed his eyes, and whispered to himself, let's hope they finally see. Outside, the city lights flickered softly. Somewhere in the distance, police sirens wailed again, but this time they sounded different. Not harsh, not cruel, just human. Marcus leaned back, Ranger resting his head on his lap. For the first time in a long while, he felt something deep inside. Not pride, not anger, but peace. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be seen. Days passed since the news about Marcus Reed spread across Rockdale. The city buzzed with conversation. Radio hosts debated police behavior. Neighbors whispered apologies, and strangers stopped by Marcus's building just to shake his hand. But Marcus stayed the same, quiet, humble, and private. He didn't want fame. He didn't want attention. He just wanted peace. Every morning he followed the same routine. He'd make coffee, sit by the window, and watch the sun spill over the rooftops. Ranger would nudge his leg, asking for breakfast, and Marcus would laugh softly. Despite the chaos outside, inside his home, peace still lived. But that peace was interrupted one afternoon when Captain Harris knocked on his door again. Marcus opened it, calm as ever. Captain, he greeted politely. Sergeant Reed, Harris said, nodding with respect. May I come in? Marcus moved his wheelchair back, allowing him inside. Harris stood for a moment, clearly nervous. He had something to ask. Something heavy. We're holding a training seminar for new recruits next week, Harris began. The topic is ethics, discipline, and human judgment. The department's been under pressure since what happened. People want change. Marcus looked at him silently. Harris continued. I was hoping you'd speak to them. About control. About seeing people for who they are, not what they look like. Marcus stayed quiet, his gaze thoughtful. You think a few words will fix what's broken? He asked gently. Harris sighed. Maybe not. But it's a start. And coming from you, it might make them listen. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. Then finally, he nodded once. All right. I'll come. But not for them. For the ones who will come after them. The following week, the police training hall was packed. Rows of fresh-faced recruits sat in silence, whispering nervously. They'd heard the stories. the Delta Force veteran in a wheelchair who had once faced death and survived. Now he was coming to speak to them. When Marcus rolled into the room, the atmosphere changed instantly. The room fell quiet. No one spoke. No one even moved. He wasn't wearing medals or a uniform, just a plain shirt, dark jeans, and a quiet confidence that filled the space. Captain Harris introduced him briefly, then stepped aside. Marcus looked around slowly, his eyes scanning the room. "You all wear badges," he began, his voice low but commanding. "That means something. It means people trust you to protect them. But protection doesn't start with power. It starts with perspective." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Not long ago," he continued, "two of your fellow officers saw me on the street and assumed I was a criminal. They didn't ask questions. They didn't see the man. They saw an image." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Marcus's tone remained calm, not angry, not bitter, just truthful. "I spent years overseas," he said, "leading men into places most people can't even imagine. I've seen fear. I've seen hate. And I've learned that neither wins. What wins is control. The moment you lose control and of your temper, your judgment, or your humanity, you've already lost the fight." He looked around the room, his eyes sharp, yet kind. "You think wearing this badge makes you powerful?" He paused. "No, it makes you responsible." A young recruit in the back raised his hand timidly. "Sir," he said, "how did you forgive them? The officers who arrested you?" Marcus looked at him for a long time before answering. "Because forgiveness isn't about them," he said softly. "It's about me. If I carry their mistake forever, I become part of it. I've seen too much hate in the world to let it live inside me." The room was utterly still. Every word he spoke carried weight, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. "Out there," Marcus said, pointing toward the door. "You'll meet people who don't trust you, who fear you, who test you. Don't prove them right. Prove them wrong by being better." His voice softened. "I lost my legs saving my team in a war that most people will never hear about. I don't regret it. What I regret is that I had to come home and fight another kind of battle, one that should never exist." He paused again, then smiled faintly. "But maybe today that changes." The recruits sat frozen, some with tears in their eyes. Even the older officers standing in the back looked down, ashamed and moved at the same time. Captain Harris stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly. "Thank you, Marcus, truly." Marcus nodded. "Just remember one thing," he said quietly. "Strength isn't how loud you are. It's how calm you stay when the world pushes you to break." With that, he turned his chair and began to leave. The room erupted in applause, not the kind given out of formality, but from deep respect. As he reached the doorway, one of the recruits whispered to another, "He's more of a commander now than he ever was in uniform." Marcus smiled faintly as he rolled down the hall. Outside, the afternoon sun touched his face, warm and bright. Ranger waited by the steps, tail wagging. He looked up at the sky for a long time and whispered, "Another mission done." Because even without a uniform, without medals or weapons, Marcus Reed was still leading a battlefield. Only this time the war was for hearts. And once again, he was winning. The hall was silent long after Marcus Reed left that day. His words had landed like stones in still water, small at first, but their ripples spread far and deep. Every officer who had listened sat thinking, not about their duty, but about themselves. About how they saw the world. About the kind of people they wanted to be. But for Marcus, the speech was just another step forward. He didn't want to be remembered as a victim or even a hero, only as a man who refused to let the world turn him bitter. The following week, Captain Harris reached out again. "Marcus," he said over the phone, "that talk you gave, it changed people. The recruits won't stop talking about it. The city council wants to invite you to speak at a community event next weekend. Not just to officers this time, kind to everyone." Marcus hesitated. "I'm not much for speeches, Captain." "You don't need to give a speech," Harris replied. "Just tell them what you told me, what the battlefield taught you." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then sighed softly. "All right," he said. "But I'm not dressing up for it." Harris laughed. "I wouldn't expect you to." The event was held at Rockdale Community Hall, the same place where Marcus used to help with youth programs. But this time, The seats were filled with people from every corner of the city. Police officers, teachers, students, families, even a few veterans who had heard whispers of the Delta Force man in a wheelchair. When Marcus rolled onto the stage, the crowd rose in applause. He looked around slowly, his expression calm, his presence commanding without trying. He waited for the noise to fade before speaking. "I'm not here to talk about war," he began quietly. "I'm here to talk about peace and the kind you fight for inside yourself." The audience leaned in. "I spent half my life learning how to fight," he continued. "Guns, tactics, strategy. I was trained to survive. But no one ever taught me how to live after the fight was over." He paused, looking down for a moment before raising his eyes again. "When I came home, I thought the hardest battles were behind me. I was wrong. The hardest ones were waiting, not on the battlefield, but in my own country, in my own neighborhood, in people's eyes." There was a hush. "One night," he said softly, "I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit, because two young officers saw what they expected, not what was real. I could have stayed angry. I could have shouted, cursed, fought back. But I didn't. You know why?" He looked out at the crowd, his voice steady. "Because anger builds walls. Understanding builds bridges. And I didn't spend my life fighting for freedom just to live trapped behind someone else's fear." People in the front row nodded, moved. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing themselves in his words. "I've seen men crumble under pressure," Marcus went on, "and I've seen others rise above it. The difference isn't strength, it's control. The best soldiers, the best leaders, the best people, they don't lose themselves in the chaos. They steady it." A young officer near the stage whispered to his partner, "That's exactly what the academy never teaches you." Marcus smiled faintly, as if he heard him. "You see," he said, "real power isn't about who you can control. It's about what you can control. Your words, your reactions, your choices." He glanced toward the back of the room where Captain Harris stood beside Officers Daniels and Lewis, the same two who had once arrested him. Their faces were solemn, humble. Marcus met their eyes briefly, then continued. "When those officers arrested me, I saw fear in them. Not evil, fear. And I've learned that fear can make good people do bad things. So I forgave them. Not because they deserved it, but because I didn't want their fear to live inside me." The hall was so silent that every breath felt heavy. He took a slow breath. "If you wear a badge, if you stand in uniform, or if you simply live among others, remember this. You never know the battle someone else is fighting. Sometimes the strongest people are the quietest ones. Sometimes the ones who look broken are the ones who've carried the most." A young woman in the audience wiped a tear from her cheek. A man whispered, "He's right. Completely right." Marcus's tone softened even more. "I don't want anyone to see me as a victim. I'm a soldier and still am in my own way. Only now I fight different battles. Not with bullets or orders, but with patience, forgiveness, and truth." He paused, then said something that would stay with the city for years. "You can't build peace by shouting. You build it by listening." The crowd erupted into applause, not the loud, hollow kind, but the deep, emotional kind that comes from hearts moved. Some people stood, others cried. Captain Harris clapped the hardest, his eyes shining with pride and gratitude. When Marcus rolled off stage, a group of young recruits approached him. One of them, a nervous-looking officer with shaky hands, said quietly, "Sir, I joined the force because I wanted to help people. But after hearing you today, I realize I have to understand them first." Marcus smiled warmly. "That's where help begins, son." As he left the hall, the sun was setting, the golden light pouring over the city like a promise. Marcus looked out at the horizon, the wind brushing against his face. Ranger trotted beside him, tail wagging. "We did good today," Marcus said softly, scratching the dog's head. "One step at a time, huh?" And as the last light faded, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, not because the world had changed overnight, but because he had changed something within it. A lesson not from a soldier of war, but from a soldier of the heart. Weeks passed after Marcus's speech at the community hall, but its impact didn't fade and it grew. Clips from his talk began circulating online. Someone had recorded it on their phone, and within days, millions of people had watched the man in the wheelchair, who spoke with the authority of a general and the heart of a teacher. They called him the Commander of Peace. For the first time in years, Rockdale wasn't being talked about for its crime rate or controversy, but for its change. The police department started new training programs called Perspective Before Power. It was Marcus's phrase, taken from his speech. Recruits now spent time volunteering at community centers, working with the very people they once feared. The walls between the uniforms and the citizens slowly began to crumble. Officer Daniels was the first to sign up. He hadn't been sleeping well since the night he arrested Marcus. The guilt had eaten at him, but guilt alone couldn't fix what he broke. So one morning he went to the youth center where Marcus worked. Marcus was sitting outside helping a young boy fix a broken drone. He looked up when he saw Daniels approaching. "Officer Daniels," he said calmly, without a trace of bitterness. Daniels hesitated, his voice low. "Marcus, I came to say sorry, not just for that night, but for how I saw you, for how I didn't see you." Marcus watched him carefully, then nodded. "You were doing your job," he said simply. Daniels shook his head. "No, I wasn't. I was doing what fear told me to do." "That's not the same." There was a long pause. Then Marcus extended his hand. "Then do better," he said quietly. "That's all any of us can do." Daniels shook his hand and something changed, not just between them, but within him. That handshake became the start of a new kind of understanding. Over the next few weeks, Daniels began volunteering at the youth center too. He spent time with the kids, played basketball, helped with homework. One afternoon, one of the teens looked up at him and said, "You used to be one of those mean cops, right?" Daniels chuckled. "Yeah," he admitted. "But I had a good teacher." He glanced at Marcus across the room, who just smiled and shook his head. Months later, the city of Rockdale held a public ceremony to honor local heroes. The mayor gave a long speech about courage and forgiveness, but the moment everyone waited for was when Marcus's name was called. The crowd stood as he rolled onto the stage, wearing a simple gray suit. The applause was thunderous, echoing through the square. The mayor handed him a plaque, but Marcus barely looked at it. His eyes were on the people, the officers, the children, the families who once looked at him with doubt and now with respect. "Mr. Reed," the mayor said proudly, "this city owes you more than we can ever repay." Marcus smiled softly. "No, sir," he said into the microphone. "You don't owe me anything. Just promise me one thing, that we keep learning, because change doesn't come from speeches or ceremonies. It comes from how we treat each other when no one's watching." The crowd fell silent, a silence full of emotion. He continued, "I'm not perfect. None of us are. But if a man in a wheelchair can stand for something, then anyone can." The audience erupted again, not just clapping, but cheering, crying, smiling. People weren't just celebrating Marcus Reed. They were celebrating the better version of themselves he had helped them find. After the ceremony, Marcus returned home. The lights of the city shimmered in the distance, soft and golden. He rolled out onto his small balcony, feeling the cool night breeze on his face. Ranger rested beside him, tail thumping lazily. He thought back to everything: the arrest, the humiliation, the anger he had buried deep, and the choice he made to forgive instead of fight. He remembered the faces of the soldiers he once led, brave, loyal, unbreakable. And then he remembered the faces of the young recruits he had spoken to, uncertain, learning, but hopeful. Different worlds. "Same mission," he whispered softly to himself. Mission complete. Just then a message buzzed on his phone. It was from Captain Harris. "Marcus, we started a mentorship program for veterans and officers together. We named it after you, the Reed Initiative. Thank you for showing us what real strength looks like." Marcus stared at the message for a long time, his eyes misting. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. He looked up at the stars instead, the night sky vast and peaceful. For the first time in a long while, he felt that the world, broken as it was, still had a chance. Because kindness had found its way through fear. Because one man chose calm over rage. Because a soldier had shown a city how to fight without fists. Ranger barked softly, nudging his leg. Marcus smiled and patted his head. "Yeah, buddy," he said quietly. It was worth it. And as the city lights flickered below and the stars shone above, Marcus Reed, the fearless ex-Delta Force commander who once faced war and prejudice, closed his eyes with a gentle smile. He had fought his last battle, and this time peace had won.